Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Monday, November 14th. And tonight, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly announces new sanctions against 23 Russians and $500 million for Ukraine's military. The announcements at the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, are part of Canadian efforts to isolate Russia on the world stage. Ms. Joly says Ukraine's armed forces will receive surveillance and communications equipment, this as well as fuel and medical supplies. Shortly after Ms. Joly announced the sanctions, Russia said that it was adding 100 Canadians to the list of people banned from entering the country. Now, this includes author Margaret Atwood and actor Jim Carrey. All right, well, meanwhile, Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem has some more bad news for already cash-strapped Canadians. He told a conference on diversity, equity, and inclusion that an impending economic slowdown will hit low-income Canadians the hardest. He says there is no simple way to ease inflation and restore price stability, but that the ultimate outcome of raising interest rates will be better for all Canadians. Mr. Macklem says economics is having a Me Too reckoning and acknowledged that women in finance face harassment. All right, turning to Ontario, where the Chief Medical Officer of Health is not imposing a broad mask mandate. But at a morning news conference, Dr. Kieran Moore strongly recommended that everyone mask up in all indoor public settings. This in order to protect children from a triple threat of respiratory viruses. A surge of pediatric respiratory virus cases has overwhelmed Ontario's children's hospitals with very sick patients. Now, this is leading to cancellations of non-urgent surgeries. Dr. Moore says he is discussing and reviewing the possibility of requiring masks in schools again. Meanwhile, Quebec's College of Physicians is recommending that people wear masks in crowded public places and public transit. The NDP wants an official inquiry into the Trudeau government's COVID-19 pandemic response. Health critic Don Davies says it's about time for the government to look back at whether appropriate actions were taken to manage the crisis. The NDP wants to see a review that is broad in scope, conducted in public, and at arm's length from government. Critics are welcoming the review of Canada's extradition system by the House of Commons Justice Committee. Although hearing dates have yet to be set, the committee plans to hear from witnesses in at least 3 sessions, which could begin before the end of the year. Legal and human rights experts say Canada's extradition procedures need a thorough overhaul. Moving to Quebec now, where a federation of women's shelters has responded to the killing of a 69-year-old woman. It says if a police theory is correct, there have now been 14 women killed by a current or former intimate partner this year in the province. Donna Callahan Oligny was found seriously injured at a home in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu on Saturday. She was later pronounced dead in hospital. Her 64-year-old husband, Terry Oligny, has been arrested and charged with second-degree murder. In Western Canada, a Regina fire official says a house that exploded on the weekend was owned by the Saskatchewan Housing Corporation and was vacant at the time. However, Deputy Fire Chief Gord Hewitt says his department can't rule out any casualties until all the debris is cleared out. The cause of the explosion is under investigation. Climate experts are warning that British Columbia could see another devastating storm sooner than later. A storm last year flooded farmland, washed out major highways and rail lines, and killed 5 people. The Insurance Bureau of Canada says the record rains caused by an atmospheric river was BC's costliest weather event. It had insured losses of $675 million. University of Victoria climate scientist Francis Sweers says what was once a 100-year event is now more likely a once-in-12 years phenomenon. On the East Coast, the remnants of Hurricane Nicole destroyed a sea arch in PEI National Park. This was 7 weeks after post-tropical storm Fiona knocked over the popular Teacup Rock Formation. The sea arch at Mackenzie's Brook collapsed yesterday in strong winds and heavy rain. PEI's North Shore suffered extensive damage during Fiona, and parts of the national park are still closed. The Grey Cup is set for Sunday. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers will face the Toronto Argonauts in Sunday's Grey Cup game at Mosaic Stadium in Regina. The Argos defeated the visiting Montreal Alouettes in yesterday's East Division final, 34-27. This while the Blue Bombers beat the BC Lions 28-20 at home in the West Division final. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back with a look at Canada's shortage of children's painkillers and what can be done about it. So stay with us. We'll be back in a short moment. A 6-month Canada-wide shortage of children's painkillers has parents reaching out to pharmacists about alternate forms of treatment. Meanwhile, some are crowding hospital rooms to get access to the scarce medication. Health Canada issued an advisory earlier last month warning that children's ibuprofen and acetaminophen were in short supply due to unprecedented demand. Now today, Health Canada said a foreign supply of children's acetaminophen will be available in pharmacies in the coming weeks. This while ibuprofen shipments have already arrived and are being distributed to hospitals. Meanwhile, cold and flu season this year comes with the added risk of COVID-19 variants and an uptick in respiratory syncytial virus among children. Well, joining us now to give us the latest on the situation and her advice for parents is Dr. Banerji, a pediatrics expert and associate public health and pediatrics professor at the University of Toronto. Dr. Banerji, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we mentioned Health Canada is securing foreign supplies of acetaminophen, and ibuprofen shipments have already arrived in Canada. So considering these efforts, what is the current state of this national shortage?
Well, from what I see and what I hear, there's still it's very difficult to get ibuprofen and acetaminophen from over the counter. So it's still a big issue for many parents right now as we're having a huge wave of respiratory viruses, febrile respiratory illnesses.
So what other options do parents have when it comes to children's painkillers? Are there any natural options, any online options?
Well, there are things you can use like lots of fluids, chicken soup, etc., lozenges. For as far as fever, you can take adult medications, and it's based on weight. So ibuprofen is 10 milligrams per kilogram. So a 20-kilo kid can have a 200 milligram adult ibuprofen, and you can crush it. Or a 10-kilo kid could have half a 200 milligrams. So there are ways of doing that. I would be careful with some of the medications that are not actually meant for those things. Naturopathic things or things online. I'd be very careful because you need to know what the active ingredients are.
All right, Doctor. And we also mentioned that some parents are taking their kids to the ER for pain medication. What are your thoughts on that?
So right now, ERs are overwhelmed. They are in crisis. Kids are waiting for, I hear, anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. And so we should not be going to the emergency department and causing increased burden there to get prescriptions. So most of these infections, these viral infections, although they're very uncomfortable, they will go away, given a certain period of time, almost all less than 1 week. So, it's not great to see your kids suffer with a fever, but it's not life-threatening right now. And most of those kids, as long as they're feeding well, breathing okay, not lethargic, they will recover from this. So you shouldn't be going to the emergency department. Emergency departments are meant for emergencies where a child is having a real distress. And so there are alternatives, like if you can get a prescription from your family doctor, if you can take adult medications and divide it up, you can go talk to pharmacists if they're not overwhelmed to see if they can compound it. So there are other things that you can do.
All right, Dr. Banerjee, about a little over a minute left here, but let's talk about some preventative measures. How can parents protect their kids from contracting viruses in this virus-filled world?
So I think first thing is mask mandates or masks. RSV and influenza are droplets. They're spread through droplets, so masks really work. Get your children vaccinated against COVID and influenza. If you have a young child, make sure that there's no one sick coming to visit that child, and putting on masks. If it's an outsider, and making sure that if it's a young baby, to wash your hands. So those are some things you can do. If your child or anyone is sick, stay at home. You don't want to spread this, especially now. You don't want a sick child or someone else to have a sick child where they can't have access to acetaminophen or ibuprofen, and emergency departments are overwhelmed and there's no hospital bed. So right now, you don't want your kids to get sick.
Some important advice to consider. Dr. Banerji, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
You're welcome.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a deeper look at some more news stories and headlines from across Canada and around the world. The Prime Minister is attending the G20 summit in Indonesia. The RCMP arrests a Hydro-Quebec employee on allegations of espionage for China. And a New Zealand study looks at reducing methane emissions from farm animals. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up next, so stay tuned. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Cambodia this weekend for the summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Mr. Trudeau used his time at the ASEAN conference to announce $333 million worth of projects related to the looming Indo-Pacific strategy and nearly $1 million towards the removal of unexploded landmines and cluster bombs in the region. Mr. Trudeau left the summit with a commitment from ASEAN to elevate Canada as a strategic partner, which is the bloc's highest tier for countries outside of Southeast Asia. Back at home, a Montreal area Hydro-Quebec employee who allegedly sent trade secrets to China is due in court tomorrow. 35-year-old Yu Sheng Wang is charged with obtaining trade secrets using a computer without authorization, fraud, and breach of trust by a public officer. The RCMP's National Security Enforcement Team started investigating in August. Now, this was after receiving a complaint from Hydro-Quebec's Corporate Security Branch. Ontario's fall fiscal update was released today. The province is projecting improving deficits over the next couple of years, nearly coming to balance in 2 years. This comes despite an expected economic slowdown. The province's fall economic outlook forecasts a deficit of $12.9 billion this fiscal year. This is followed by $8.1 billion the following year and a deficit of just $700 million in 2024 to 25. Government officials say a nearly $7 billion improvement in this year's deficit from the spring budget is largely due to higher nominal GDP and inflation. Turning to Quebec now, which is taking steps to fight climate change. This is part of a 5-year strategy to mobilize the province to take action to combat climate change. The Quebec government has announced $46.4 million in funding for citizen-led initiatives to fight climate change. Environment Minister Benoit Charest made the announcement today. This was after meeting with the Quebec delegation at the COP27 climate conference in Egypt. He says any group can submit a project for funding, but the government is particularly interested in working with Indigenous communities. Well, in other climate news in Canada, a recent survey looks at oil and gas facilities in the country. The survey indicates the amount of a potent greenhouse gas escaping into the atmosphere has been severely underestimated. A retired oil and gas regulator from Texas surveyed 128 facilities along the Alberta-Saskatchewan boundary this summer. This was by using an infrared camera, and it found methane escaping from virtually all of them. Meanwhile, satellite imagery this week captured giant plumes of methane escaping landfills in Quebec. Moving to Africa now, where countries want to increase the amount of money they receive from plans that offset greenhouse gas emissions. They are looking for ways to address the issue at UN climate talks that are currently underway in Egypt. Carbon offsets are currently cheaper to purchase in Africa than in many parts of the world. They allow polluters to effectively cancel out their emissions by paying into initiatives such as tree planting. African countries are looking to the climate talks to get a better price on the carbon market. This to help achieve their own emissions reduction targets and move toward clean energy. All right, staying on the COP27 conference, where global climate talks have resumed after a one-day break. The second half of the talks opened with plenty of uncertainty. It was about whether delegates from almost 200 countries will be able to reach a substantial deal to combat climate change. Some delegates are already talking about the possibility of a walkout by developing nations. This, unless key demands for more aid to poor countries are met. In other climate developments, the question of how to stop a cow from burping has become the subject of a huge scientific inquiry in New Zealand. Now, this is where farming is essential to the economy. More specifically, the question is how to stop cows, sheep, and other farm animals from belching out so much methane. Among the more promising solutions are selective breeding, genetically modified food, methane inhibitors, and a potential game changer, a vaccine. New Zealand's government has promised to reduce methane emissions from farm animals by up to 47% by 2050. This is part of a push to become carbon neutral. All right, well, back here in Canada, 6 new names will be officially enshrined into the Hockey Hall of Fame tonight. The class of 2022 includes Ottawa Senators' all-time leading scorer, Daniel Alfredson, Vancouver Canucks players Roberto Luongo, Daniel Sedin, and Henrik Sedin, Finnish women's player Riikka Salonen, and the late Herb Carnegie in the Builders category. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world. The presidents of the U.S. and China hold talks while Ukraine's Kherson celebrates the end of its 8-month-long Russian occupation. We'll have these stories and more up next after a short break, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. The presidents of the U.S. and China shook hands as they met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping have agreed to empower key senior officials on areas of potential cooperation. Now, this includes tackling climate change and maintaining global financial health and food stability. The two leaders met for about 3 hours today ahead of the G20 summit in Indonesia. The White House says Mr. Biden also objected to China's increasingly aggressive actions toward Taiwan and raised human rights concerns. Now, even as they deal with the extensive damage done to their city, residents of Kherson are celebrating the end of Russia's 8-month occupation. People with Ukrainian flags draped around their shoulders cheered, cried, and screamed out in gratitude. This came as President Volodymyr Zelensky made a triumphant visit to the newly liberated city of Kherson. He called the Russian withdrawal the beginning of the end of the war. This as he walked the streets awarding medals to soldiers and posing with them for selfies. Moving to Turkey now, where one person has been arrested following a deadly explosion on a pedestrian street in Istanbul. 6 people were killed and dozens more were wounded in the blast, which was on the popular thoroughfare lined with shops and restaurants that leads to the iconic Taksim Square. Police said the woman had confessed to planting the bomb and that she had been trained by Kurdish militant groups. The Kurdish group, however, denied any links to the attack, saying that it does not target civilians. Funerals were held on Monday for all 6 of the victims. All right, well, next door in Iran, state media says Revolutionary Court has sentenced an anti-government protester to death and handed jail terms to 5 others. The ruling likely marks the first death sentence in the trials of those arrested for participating in the protests, which have swept Iran over the past weeks, demanding an end to clerical rule. Mizan, a news website linked to Iran's judiciary, said the death sentence followed on charges of the protesters setting fire to a government building. Security forces have violently cracked down on the demonstrations. They have killed over 300 people. Now, this includes dozens of children, according to the Oslo-based Iran Human Rights. The group of 7 leading economies launched a new insurance system today. It aims to provide swift financial aid when nations are hit by devastating effects of climate change. The so-called Global Shield is backed by the V20, an alliance of climate-vulnerable nations chaired by Ghana, and the G7, chaired by Germany. The scheme is designed to kick in with aid in the event of climate-related disasters in vulnerable nations. But critics argue that it doesn't cover slower climate change effects, which includes rising seas or the slow loss of arable land. Nor does the plan account for historical harms. The interior ministers of France and the UK have signed a joint agreement in Paris to try to curb migration across the English Channel, which is a regular source of friction between the two countries. The UK government has agreed to pay some 72.2 million euros to France in 2022 to 2023. Now, this is in exchange for France increasing its security presence by 40% across sea access points along the coast. All right, turning our attention to Haiti, where Prime Minister Ariel Henry has dismissed the Justice Minister, Interior Minister, and its government commissioner. This comes in a fresh round of political upheaval. The former Justice Minister first fired the government commissioner on Mr. Henry's orders. Now, this was before being ousted himself days later, along with the Interior Minister. The report is according to documents that the Associated Press obtained on Monday. Mr. Henry did not say why the officials were removed, and his spokesman could not be immediately reached for comment. Pop star and actor Selena Gomez has won an award. This was for drawing inspiration from her personal journey to help others worldwide get access to mental health counseling and other services. The 30-year-old has made no secret of her personal mental health struggles, and she has become an outspoken advocate for awareness and getting other young people to get the help they need. A 47-year-old German woman has become the first female solo hiker to walk the Trans-Canada Trail from the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific coasts. It took Melanie Vogel 5.5 years and 15 pairs of hiking boots to do the 20,000-kilometer walk from coast to coast to coast. Now, that's about 26 million steps. She took off her hiking boots and did a dance in the chilly Pacific in Victoria, BC yesterday. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.